Want to learn how to create a brand for your handmade business? If you're just getting started but don't know where to start, you're in the right place. In this video, I'm going to be talking to my friend Holly Marsh about how to get started branding your creative business. Holly is the founder of E-commerce Arcade, where she specializes in leveling up your e-commerce game with Shopify as well as Klaviyo for e-commerce email marketing. She's an illustrator and branding designer with more than a decade of experience selling handmade products online and in person. Hi, Holly. So if somebody is a brand new handmade business owner, they want to create a brand for their business, they don't know how to start. How do they start?
A really good question. And that's a common struggle with someone just starting out their business, whether it's handmade or not. And I think that the biggest thing is they probably think about how much is this going to cost me? And it can cost you a lot or it can cost you a little. It all kind of depends on your own skill set and maybe people you know who are willing to help you, or you could do a trade. I do recommend that starting with a really memorable, solid logo that's readable, like print it out in really small print and like see how far you can go until you don't see it anymore. Because if you have a logo that's really unreadable, whether it's a very flourishy script font, it's not really going to make an impact and be memorable for someone who is seeing you at a craft show and seeing that banner. They may have to like really look to see what it says, but at the same time, it's not memorable.
Yeah, and that's a good point about like making sure you can still read it at different sizes, because think about if you're going to have like a version of your logo on social media and it's that tiny little Instagram logo in the corner, it needs to be very easy to read.
And it has to work with your business name. And I had a longer business name for my handmade business, and actually even my current business, e-commerce arcade, is a little long. But I also have had clients who have a long single word business name, and so it's a struggle to kind of shrink that into a circle for an avatar. So that's where like alternate marks like a brand seal or a word mark really can help leverage that memorability with a brand identity.
Yeah, and I was going to say, can you explain a little bit more about the difference between a full logo and a brand mark and why it can be helpful to kind of have both? They're kind of two different versions of a logo, essentially, right?
So you can think of a logo as like your primary logo, the thing that you use most often. And it usually is the name of your business in a typeface, or, even if it's a handwritten, hand lettered kind of situation. And a brand mark is usually something like either your brand name or maybe even just a really iconic illustration or icon. So a good example of this that you can think of is like Apple, the brand. It's just a really simple word mark, Apple, that's their logo, but we all remember the actual like brand mark, which is the apple. And that's usually, and that's the thing about branding that can be surprising, is sometimes you'll have this, you may hire someone to do your brand identity, or you may do it yourself, and you might find that there are some elements that are part of that brand identity that stand out even more, or they're a little more memorable. They kind of they take on a life of their own, and it's really exciting. But ultimately the goal is so that all of the elements within your brand identity are cohesive, and that they're memorable, to where when someone can even visualize like even your brand colors or what you make, that they're immediately going to associate it with your brand.
Okay, so you've got a logo, maybe you've got a brand mark too. What's next? What are the other parts of branding that especially somebody like at the very early stages of a business needs to consider?
Well, I think that if you're just getting started and if you're on a budget, I'd say that a logo and a color palette are probably going to be your best bet just to get started. And then you can always build off of that. And maybe even down the road, you rebrand with a full identity suite of assets. And what I mean by assets are like graphics, illustrations, patterns, color palette, typography, or, a couple of logo treatments. So that's like the whole gamut of things that could be part of that. But if you're going more simple, I would say like a logo, again, that's really memorable and that's flexible. So whether you're having to fit it into a wide banner or even like a circular avatar, it works. And also using color as part of that brand identity, and trying to stick with that. And I know that not everything matches exactly. So if you're trying to buy like solid colored tissue paper for your orders, it's not going to be that exact Pantone, and that is okay. But if you're using the same colors throughout, people will start to associate those colors with your brand.
Yeah, I mean, well, you're like a perfect example with your background right now, right? You've got like pink headphones, pink sweater, like everything's pink. And so if a brand had kind of a color palette like that, right? Like pastels and like super like cutesy, sort of like playful like pinks, you might not expect to see like earth tones associated with that brand. I mean, you could, but it's like you're creating kind of boundaries around what you do and don't do as far as colors. And that helps with things like social media posts and your website. And like you said, even tissue paper and your packaging and everything like that.
Exactly. And also like when you're crafting your like if you do craft shows and you're designing your booth experience, bring that, you can bring like your brand into pretty much anything you do in your business.
Yeah, I used to do that back when I was running my handmade business. Like a dark kind of cobalt blue was one of my colors. And I was able to find the tablecloths that were fitted to my booth and the little organza tissue bags for jewelry. And so, yeah, it really helps just sort of pull things all together.
Exactly.
Do you have any other final like branding tips for people just getting started?
I think that just trying to focus on, so if you were to like have a budget for a designer, I would say that, if you just kind of know what you want and figure out like what that cap is of like, I don't want to spend more than X amount of dollars, and then see if someone can work with you to make that happen. And the biggest thing when it comes to getting started with a brand identity is really knowing your target customer. And I know that sounds kind of like more homework, but it's so, so important because like Mallory said, if you chose pastel pink and white as your brand colors, but your target customer is like, nope, 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 I want all like blacks and grays, it's going to be a little bit of a disconnect and you're going to have to work that much harder to really get that person to like, know, and trust you to purchase from you.
Yeah, and I think it's important too when people are first starting, like you don't have to lock in your brand identity for the life of your rest of your business, right? Like pick something that you can that matches your target customer as well as you know and understand them at this point. And something that'll last you a year or two, maybe, and then reevaluate as you learn more about your business and your customers and all that stuff.
Exactly. You can rebrand and it is okay. And you can even rename your business. There's a whole process, but it is okay. There's no law in the world that's like you chose this brand and you must stick with it for all eternity or else. So
Yeah. Well, even you mentioned Apple as an example. Like think about big brands. Big brands refresh and rebrand all of the time, and it's okay.
yeah, Google Coca-Cola's brand like evolution, and they do ever so slight little touches all the time. And bigger brands actually have a disadvantage in the fact that if they do anything really drastic with their branding, it usually causes a knee-jerk negative reaction. So by being, a smaller handmade business, you have an advantage of being able to kind of use this as your playground in figuring out what works and what doesn't and to kind of tweak things. And when you get to a point where you're like, I've got a really good idea of who my target customer is, I've got a really good idea of what my brand identity, the vibe should look like, that might be a good time to work with a designer.
For sure. Well, awesome. Thank you so much, Holly.
Thanks, Mallory.